2021 was quite a year. A lot happened across many sectors everywhere around the world. But regarding gaming in particular, we saw a lot of delays caused by the still ongoing global pandemic and the continued shortage of semiconductors, leading to a frustratingly low inventory of things like current-gen video game consoles, gaming GPUs, and even cars. Thankfully, that didn't completely stop the gaming industry from pumping out some noteworthy hits for everyone to enjoy. We had some long-awaited sequels finally come out, promising new IPs, and jaw-dropping showcases of shiny new current-gen technology. And now's the time for me to finally go over my favorites that released within those 365 days, especially since my Elden Ring videos are now done. Some of you might be thinking, hold on a second, it's April already. Why bother now? The simple answer is, I needed some time to go back and play some interesting games that I wasn't able to buy back when they came out. Basically, I'm the type of person who plays catch-up with missed releases. It helps a lot. A catch-up game made it onto my top 5 last year, so it could happen again. However, it should also go without saying, I am a normal guy with a normal income and only so many hours in a week to dedicate to video games. Especially after taking up a new full-time job back in August, which leaves me with more money to spend on games, yes, but less time to play them. The ultimate conundrum of being an adult. Because of this, I tend to keep future releases in mind based on priority, from games that I desperately want to play on day one, to games that I'll probably play during my catch-up time. Oh, and I still don't own a Switch because I promised myself I wouldn't buy one until Bayonetta 3 received a concrete release date. I am stubborn, I know. Thanks to my new job though, I was able to play a few more games than I normally would. Generally speaking, I think almost all the games I played from last year were pretty good. But at the end of the day, I had to narrow it down to the best 5. Although, a few more were still good enough to deserve a shout-out in the form of an honorable mentions list. These titles are in no particular order unless stated otherwise. Basically, these are games I liked a lot, but they came just shy of making it onto the final cut. Like I said, I'm just one guy, and this is all arbitrary in the grand scheme of things. Anyway, the first honorable mention goes to Resident Evil 4 VR. Now this is bordering on cheating because RE4 is obviously not a brand new game, but the newly released VR version is something special. It took a game I loved and played a dozen times throughout the years and somehow made it even more fun. The gameplay was completely overhauled to better suit the virtual reality experience in all the right ways. Manual reloading, being able to walk while aiming, dual wielding, and a generally increased combat pace. Granted, it also makes the game a lot easier in terms of challenge, but goddamn do I not care, because it's just so fucking fun. Resident Evil 4 single-handedly justified my purchase of a Quest 2. It is that good to me. My second honorable mention goes to Hitman 3. The new Hitman trilogy has proven to be one of the most consistently entertaining and high-quality set of games over the last several years. It's seriously impressive how IO Interactive has managed to maintain such a standard, especially considering their alarming financial troubles and sudden restructuring during the development of Hitman 2. The World of Assassination trilogy caps off with an experience that is just as immersive, satisfying, and full of choice as the previous 2 games, with tons of ways to kill your targets and a bunch of challenges to complete, both developer-made and player-made. I greatly look forward to IO's James Bond game, which is the most fitting developer and license pairing I've probably ever seen. My third honorable mention goes to Tormented Souls. There's a lot of indie games out there designed to be a love letter to the golden age of survival horror, but Tormented Souls is probably the best one yet. It's not perfect, but it truly captures, or at least understands, the essence of what made Resident Evil and Silent Hill so good back in the late 90s. It has a metric ton of puzzles and a labyrinthine mansion setting, almost too labyrinthine for my habitual map opening ass, featuring an incredible amount of environmental detail, plus a story that's mostly told through journal entries scattered around the game. It's a true successor to the traditional survival horror formula that's more or less disappeared from the AAA horror sphere since the big action horror surge in the late 2000s to early 2010s. If you love classic Resident Evil and Silent Hill, I wholeheartedly suggest picking this up. Continuing our commendation of indie titles, my fourth honorable mention is The Forgotten City. There's a pretty deep history within gaming of great overhaul mods for existing games becoming their own standalone titles, and The Forgotten City is one of them. Originally released in 2015 as a mod for Skyrim, the small but talented team over at Modern Storyteller turned The Forgotten City into its own unique experience. A first-person mystery game with sparse RPG elements set in an ancient Roman village that focuses heavily on dialogue sequences and speech checks. And there's even a time loop gimmick on top of that. It's a small but memorable game that knows how to leave an impression with its focused cast of colorful characters and tons of meaningful verbal exchanges and choices. There's multiple endings and multiple ways to reach them, so replayability is present too. After playing this, I am deeply interested in what Modern Storyteller makes next. And now my fifth and final honorable mention, Disco Elysium, The Final Cut. This is the only honorable mention I'll give a placement by saying that if my list were top 6 games of the year, then this would be number 6. Granted, it's not necessarily a 2021 game because Disco Elysium initially released in 2019. However, I didn't play that release. By the time I was contemplating giving it a shot, the final cut was already announced, and goddamn am I glad that I waited, because the added voice acting is nothing short of superb. It adds so much character and humor to an already charismatic and hilarious script, supported by an eye-catching art style on top of that. Mechanically, Disco Elysium is also just one of the best dialogue-based RPGs you can get your hands on. It's absolutely remarkable just how many ways there are to play a game where you just talk, and there's actual, genuine builds too. There's so much stuff to interact with and so many ways to do so that a detailed, leisurely playthrough can probably last upwards of 40 to 45 hours, and that's only playing one way. It's a gem of a game for sure, and the Final Cut version only makes it more so. That concludes my honorable mentions. All great games in their own right, and potentially Game of the Year winners depending on who you ask, and I wouldn't argue with any of them. But ultimately, I ended up preferring 5 other games above them. So, without any more stalling, let's dive into my top 5 games of 2021. Number 5. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. I will absolutely be the first to admit that a bit of nostalgia bias does play a part in this decision, because the Ratchet & Clank series is one of the longest running franchises that I still actively enjoy. Even after 20 years, these games managed to pull out the child version of me. I've always loved the vibrant art direction, the sense of humor, the variety of planets, the badass coliseums, and above all else, the arsenal of creative and satisfying weapons that obliterate the enemy in a robust display of chaos. The Ratchet & Clank series is quite possibly the textbook definition of, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. Some might see that as emblematic of laziness or a lack of desire to innovate, but I see it as simply not making any unnecessary changes in a tone-deaf attempt to reinvent the wheel, which is sometimes the downfall of certain sequels. But that's not to say that Rift Apart doesn't have any cool new ideas. The introduction of co-protagonist Rivet and the mechanic of mid-level dimension hopping were undoubtedly a couple of the best decisions Insomniac has made with the IP in a long time. There's also armor sets divided into head, chest, and boot pieces There's wall running, grapple hooking, and a true dodge. There's minigames in the form of hacking by controlling a small spider tank named Glitch, and puzzle solving as Clank, which is basically a series staple. We waited a whopping 5 years for another Ratchet & Clank game, and the wait paid off, because we were given one of the best in the series. However, even more impressive than the game's persistent ability in keeping its 2-decade-old formula feeling fun and fresh is the incredible technical performance. Rift Apart was the first PlayStation 5 game to truly, genuinely feel completely next-gen. It gave off the sensation that it simply wasn't in the realm of possibility for the PlayStation 4 to handle this game, at least not without some major sacrifices that would have worsened the experience. The levels had remarkable detail and draw distances, the haptic feedback utilization felt amazing, the 3D audio was mesmerizing, and the loading times were so blazingly fast that they sincerely seemed non-existent. But even beyond all of that, I think the most outstanding feature is the game's general balance in all 3 of its performance modes. It's more or less become standard for games to now offer the choice between prioritizing graphical fidelity and resolution or prioritizing frame rate. But Insomniac has once again proven themselves to basically be wizards in this regard with the amazing performance ray tracing mode, which sets the game at a 1440p resolution while keeping the awesome ray tracing enabled and maintaining a rock-solid 60 frames per second. It is undeniably the best way to play the game, because you get the quick response times of 60 frames per second while also getting the visual feast of the game's gorgeous ray tracing technology. It's the performance mode that lets you have your cake and eat it too. But it doesn't even stop there. Insomniac eventually released an update that allowed the quality mode, which usually runs at 4K with ray tracing, targeting 30 frames per second, to actually hit 40 frames per second if you're playing on a 120Hz display. Fucking incredible. The talented team at Insomniac must have made a deal with the devil or something, because they just impress me time and again in different ways. Overall, Rift Apart was just one hell of an experience. It was pure Ratchet & Clank fun, with all the kick-ass weapons and gadgets, colorful settings, and funny characters. But now with the added bonus of being the most technologically sensational experience in the whole series. I truly cannot recommend picking up this game enough if you have a PS5. It's a must-have that fires on all cylinders in almost every way. It just feels great, looks great, and sounds great. It is great. And I'm ecstatic to know that my favorite platforming pair is still going strong. This was a game that 12-year-old me would have enjoyed just as much as, if not more than, current-day me. And I can't help but love and respect a game that manages to bridge that gap. Number 4. Resident Evil Village. Following the release of Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 2 Remake, fans of the franchise were extremely excited to see what direction it was going in. Before Village was even announced, the rumor mill was spinning at an intense speed about it being more like a spiritual successor to the more action-oriented Resident Evil 4, as opposed to a more horror-focused experience like Resident Evil 7, and those rumors ended up being true. Starring Ethan Winters once again as the main protagonist, we head over to Europe to save his kidnapped daughter, who was taken by Chris Redfield after leading an assault on the family's home and murdering Mia in the process. The search leads him to the game's titular village, where things don't seem very normal. The entire area is infested with lichens, never-before-seen enemies in a series dedicated mostly to zombies, bioengineered monstrosities, and parasitic entities. It's soon discovered that the village and its surroundings are controlled by an enigmatic woman named Mother Miranda and her children, people who are granted powers through experimentation with the dreaded mold that we encountered in Resident Evil 7. Village's decision to be more adventurous instead of spooky was a bit of a risky one to make, considering the franchise's heavily criticized past of deviating too far from its horror roots once before. But the game still managed to latch on to aspects of the survival horror genre that the Resident Evil name helped create. The village area is fairly large and open, and you return to it multiple times throughout the story to unlock more sections of it. The castle feels like it would have been the primary setting of any other Resident Evil game, filled with its own share of puzzles and a mildly labyrinthine layout. After that, there's House Beneviento, which is entirely horror-centric, to the point where your weapons are all taken away, and it stars what is quite possibly the most grotesque enemy design in the franchise's history. Then there's the Reservoir, which is essentially a big chase set piece. And finally, there's the Stronghold, which is a large but linear area with a heavy focus on fighting through a ton of mechanically enhanced foes. The game even brings back the attaché case inventory system, which I absolutely love. And it gave us the Duke, our successor to RE4's Merchant. Village feels like a greatest hits album of the entire series, and that might come off as lazy to people who like one or two of these areas but not the others. But to me, I quite enjoy all of them. Resident Evil 7 was a scary game with an intense atmosphere and excellent implementations of survival horror fundamentals, and while Village's choice to turn away from some of that might alienate some fans, as almost every mainline entry does, I still found the experience to be immensely entertaining. I beat the game 5 times before I finally published my review of it. Do I think it's a flawless game? No. Mercenaries mode is pretty disappointing, and the last act, while not bad, still feels weaker than the first like all other games in the series. And the Village of Shadows being balanced around New Game Plus weapons with no meaningful changes to enemy or item placement honestly turns it into a gimmick difficulty. But the core experience was just so infectiously entertaining, I simply cannot deny how incredibly fun I found it. If there's one thing this game is truly missing though, it's VR support, because 7's VR experience was highly praised, transformative even to some people. Even regarding performance, Village knocks it out of the park. The RE engine continues to be one of the most impressive pieces of software around, with its impeccable use of photogrammetry to make some breathtaking areas with super high quality textures, like the castle. The game's also capable of maintaining a solid 60 frames per second at 4K resolution with ray tracing turned on. Now granted, the game's ray tracing technique isn't particularly robust, and some might even prefer to have it off, but that's still a pretty big accomplishment technologically speaking. The PS5 version also loads so goddamn fast that it doesn't even have loading screens like other versions do, because there's no point in having them because they would only be visible for 2, maybe 3 seconds. And another thing the game does well, and which took me by surprise, was how much it made me like Ethan. He was considered a blank slate by a lot of people who played RE7, especially compared to the likes of other, more noteworthy and charismatic main characters like Leon, Chris, Jill, and Claire, and even side characters like Ada. But Village gives him a lot of needed humanizing. He actually ends up being the emotional backbone of the story, which helps make him a protagonist worthy of the position. Overall, Village just hits all the right buttons for me. And I know a few people would probably rant for 30 straight minutes over everything they hate about it, down to a specific pixel that rubs them the wrong way on a wall somewhere in one room of the castle, but my justification is pretty simple. I just had a fucking ton of fun. And that's why I loved Resident Evil Village. Number 3. Lost Judgment. Another year, another Yakuza Universe game that makes it into my top 5. Like death and taxes, it's inescapable. My love for this franchise is simply unbounded, but I can't help if it feels like they just get better and better with almost every game, and the Judgment spin-off series is no different. Returning as the main character is Takayuki Yagami, played by Japanese superstar Takuya Kimura in both likeness and voice. He's joined by other noteworthy actors such as Koji Yamamoto and Hiroshi Tamaki as newcomers Kuwana and Soma respectively. Even before we dive into the quality of the actual game, it's pretty incredible that Ryuga Gotoku Studio has become a developer that seems to effortlessly draw in high-profile Japanese film talent. Granted, they've been casting actors for a long time, but it feels like the floodgates truly opened once they managed to grab the legendary Beat Takeshi for a fairly big support role in Yakuza 6. It's just one of several metrics with which we can measure the increased popularity of RGG Studios' works. Lost Judgment takes place 3 years after the events of the previous game, with Yagami and Kaito still active detectives in Kamurocho. They're given a case by the chairman of Seiryo High School in Isezaki Ijincho, a new location introduced in Yakuza Like a Dragon, hoping to discover a bullying issue within the student body. However, through contact with their friends over at Genda Law Office, Yagami and Kaito are suddenly pulled into another strange situation. A disgraced police officer, Akihiro Ehara, found guilty of sexual battery on public transit. To make matters even stranger, Ehara, after receiving his verdict, reveals his knowledge of a dead body and its identity in Ijincho, before the discovery of the corpse was even made public. Yagami also eventually finds threads that potentially connect Ehara's case to the bullying inside Seiryo High. But how is one police officer charged with sexual assault linked to both a corpse and high school bullying in a different city? And how deep does this connection go? It's an ambitious story in regards to all the layers that have to be peeled back in order to uncover the greater conspiracy, and it treads the thin line between complex and convoluted, but I found myself absolutely gripped the entire time, even more so than I was by the first game. Lost Judgment released hot on the heels of Yakuza Like a Dragon, which was quite possibly the most successful genre switch in the history of gaming, moving the mainline series from real-time beat-em-up action to turn-based RPG. This left a lot of people wondering about the future of the action gameplay, but it soon came to light that RGG Studio intends for the Judgment spin-off series to continue the tradition, and boy did it. Lost Judgment feels just as slick and fun to play as the previous game, but this time with the added bonus of a third fighting style, Snake, which focuses entirely on parrying. There's also boxing style that can be obtained as DLC if you feel so inclined. It feels like there's a valid way to approach every fight thanks to the plethora of offensive and defensive moves you have at your disposal. In fact, every fighting style has so many moves you can more or less stick to one of the three for the entire game. I personally preferred Crane, but I have a friend who favored Snake. The combat depth was quite impressive. Being another game on the studio's proprietary Dragon engine, the PS5 version of the game looked beautiful and performed really well, hitting a consistent 60 frames per second on the frame rate performance mode. Loading times were also really quick, rarely ever going past 5 or 6 seconds to go from one side of the city to the other. As one might expect, the true king of any Yakuza Universe game is the content, and boy oh boy does Lost Judgment have content. Aside from the gripping and dark main story, there's also a gigantic side plot revolving around Seiryo High, where Yagami must infiltrate every single student-run club to discover the identity of a shadowy figure forcing students into delinquency, and each and every club has its own big minigame attached to it, such as the boxing club having, well, boxing, but with its own unique combat system that does not play like it normally does out in the regular game world. The Robotics Club has a competitive puzzle minigame where you must cover a tile-based arena with more of your own team's colors before time runs out. The Dancing Club is, surprise surprise, a rhythm game. And then there's a biker gang related to the high school plot where you participate in death races. If it sounds like a lot, that's because it is. Completing the high school side story takes well over 15 hours or so. In fact, it might even take longer to finish than the main storyline of the game. It's insane that RGG Studio managed to stuff so much content and detail into something you don't even need to do. And this is all on top of the normal sub-stories and detective cases you can complete. Overall, Lost Judgment is just one of the best in RGG Studio's lineup, and stands among all the other heavy hitters in the Yakuza franchise. I don't know what the future holds for this spin-off series, considering Takuya Kimura's agency is rumored to be so restrictive over his likeness that they might be preventing the game from releasing on PC. But I hope it continues, because I want more Yagami and crew in my life. Number 2. Returnal. Big publishers and platform holders like Sony are considered heavily risk-averse. It's easy to understand why when you look at their list of first-party titles and seeing that a huge portion are action-adventure games with cinematic storytelling. But sometimes they put out an oddball, a game that seems to be totally antithetical to the typical crowd-pleasing stuff they would normally fund. And in 2021, that game for Sony was Returnal, an ambitious blend of third-person shooter, bullet hell, roguelite, and sci-fi psychological horror. Quite possibly the craziest hybrid of niche genres I've ever seen. And it wasn't an indie game with a limited budget that Sony just so happened to pick up on the cheap. It was a AAA release developed by none other than the talented team at Housemarque, who were no strangers to hyperkinetic and flashy gameplay, especially in the realm of twin-stick and bullet hell shooters. I was very familiar with their work prior to Returnal's release. In fact, I still maintain today that Resogun was one of the best PS4 exclusives. But now they've upped the ante by a significant amount thanks to real backing by Sony themselves. The main character is Celine, a scout for Astra Corporation who crash lands on a very dangerous and enigmatic planet named Atropos, after attempting to follow a strange signal. Upon first arriving, she quickly discovers corpses of herself and realizes she's stuck in some sort of vicious time loop that even death cannot free her from. Furthermore, every time she dies, the planet itself shifts terrain. She experiences strange events and visions that the player must piece together and encounters hostile life forms to defeat in order to find out what the true origin of the signal is, and why she can't escape the planet. And between major sections of normal combat, there are first-person sequences where Celine enters a vision of her home, and the player steadily uncovers more of her dark past, making up the psychological horror aspect of Returnal. It's a fantastic, gripping tale that expertly merges the dark sci-fi aesthetic with mind-bending suspense. In regards to combat, it's absolutely explosive. Weapons are super flashy and satisfying to use, each one featuring primary and secondary modes of fire. There's also a sword that allows for big bursts of melee damage when you're in an enemy's face, and the movement is also fast and responsive. There's several other mechanics lending itself to the roguelite portion of the experience, like parasites that give you a random buff and debuffs, and malfunctions, which are stronger debuffs that you might get by doing something you probably weren't supposed to, or perhaps as a trade-off for something else. Gameplay is simply addicting. It's hard to put the controller down once you hit your stride in a decent run. The moment you pick up a fun weapon with good attributes, the combat really takes a turn for the best. It's quick, rewarding, engaging, robust, and flashy. Graphics and performance are also stellar in this game. The visual style is superb, with the grim environments complemented by the constant bombardment of bright, dense particle effects and lights. The game runs at a native 1080p, which is then upscaled to 1440p and then checkerboarded to 4K. Sounds like a process that would create a blurry image, but no, it still manages to look quite crisp. And even if there is any blurriness, chances are you won't notice as you're zooming around in chaotic fights. The game maintains a solid 60 frames per second with only an occasional dip, and like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, it also does an excellent job at utilizing PS5 technology, including the best implementation of the adaptive trigger function I've seen so far by giving the L2 button two functions in one: a soft press for aiming down sights and a hard press for activating secondary fire. And, of course, loading times are practically non-existent here too. New zones are loaded in a flash, and you're back in the action faster than you can say atropause. If there's one big weakness this game used to have, it was the lack of save states, meaning you had to complete a run in one sitting, which was quite a task because a full run could go on for 3 hours or more. But Housemarque has since addressed this, and now I can recommend this game wholeheartedly to anyone who has a PS5 and enjoys a fun, fast-paced challenge. Overall, Returnal is simply the coolest new IP Sony has had in a long, long time. It has everything: remarkable combat, a jaw-dropping aesthetic, great performance, gripping story, amazing use of PS5 features, and an atmospheric soundtrack. If this game could be considered a risk due to its merging of niche genres, then it's a risk Sony should make more often. But at the same time, it also shows that nicheness doesn't have to be a risk if you have the talent to make a truly memorable experience. Number 1. Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker. I know, I can already hear a couple people say, hey, this isn't a new game, it's technically an expansion of an 11-year-old game. And that may be true, but at the end of the day, this is my video and I can bend the rules however I wish. And in this particular case, I'll say it counts because, as an expansion, it gives an entire new game's worth of content. And that is true. I sped through Endwalker's story content over 3 days, and it's added up to about 45 hours of playtime. And god damn, what an incredible 45 hours they were. It's difficult to truly put into perspective to people who don't play 14 how important it was for Endwalker to not just be good, but great. It was meant to cap off a saga that lasted for 8 straight years. A saga that somehow managed to only get better and better as time went on, specifically with Heavensward and Shadowbringers, the latter being so critically renowned it seemed like an insurmountable task for anything to follow it up with comparable quality. But we should have known better than to have even the slightest doubt in Yoshi P and his incredible team of super talented individuals, especially the writing of one Natsuko Ishikawa and the music of one Masayoshi Soken. Endwalker brings our player character and the scions of the Seventh Dawn to the land of Old Sharlayan, a place where learning and diplomacy is paramount, and conflict is strictly forbidden, even if that conflict threatens the world at large. The party must uncover the truth of the looming danger that is set to destroy their world, but more importantly, they must also find out if stopping it is even truly possible. As with every expansion for Final Fantasy XIV, we're given a collection of huge new areas to explore. Old Sharlayan is a gorgeous new hub city that radiates the scholarly history it so proudly maintains. And the colorful Radzat Han is exceedingly vibrant and festive. The big maps out in the segmented open world are equally dense with things to look at and do. Labyrinthos, sitting underneath Sharlayan as a man-made dome meant for raising beasts and crops, is just as awe-striking as the city above it. Thavnair, the country that houses Radzat Han, is a very eye-catching expanse of rock formations and jungle environments. There's Mare Lamentorum, which is literally the moon, a desolate yet beautiful locale where you can gaze at the abyssal majesty of the universe around you. Then we have Garlemald, a battle-scarred, snowy wasteland that looks as oppressive as it feels. And then there's Elpis, an absolutely jaw-dropping and bounteous landscape of life. The dungeons and trials are also excellent, and probably the most interesting and fun collection of duties an expansion has ever given us. One of the best decisions Yoshi P and team has made was the inclusion of the trust system back in Shadowbringers, which allows you to play these duties with NPCs, essentially turning these MMO instances into single-player experiences. Sounds counterproductive to the MMO formula, I know, but the flavor dialogue added to these places and the general competency of your AI teammates makes the system worth trying out, especially if you don't have a consistent group of reliable friends to play with. Unfortunately, I can't really go into detail about the trials without a massive risk of spoilers, but god damn are they the most epic and enthralling set of them I've ever experienced. Fun and cool mechanics, badass boss designs, awesome background environments, banging music, they have it all, and I loved doing them. The only real negative to speak of was the server queue madness that ensued for the first few weeks following Endwalker's launch. Queues were unbearably long, even in the less popular servers where you could still be forced to wait up to 45 minutes just to even start. Then there was the dreaded 2002 error, which kicked you out of the queue, and if you took too long to get back in, you were kicked to the end of the line and had to start the wait all over again. And as the cherry on top, the game suspended sales of new copies entirely in order to lessen server load. During Endwalker's launch window, Final Fantasy XIV was literally too successful and temporarily became the only MMO to ever be sold out. Talk about suffering from success. Sadly, this issue existed mainly due to the server shortage, which is a side effect of the pandemic, as Square Enix even offered double the asking price of servers but still couldn't get any. Really rough situation to be in. But as the weeks passed, the queue slowly softened up, and the team came up with really creative ideas to help make the wait more bearable, including momentarily surrendering over dev servers. Yoshi P and team sacrificed a lot to ensure their greatest expansion so far could be enjoyed by as many people as possible with as little trouble as possible, and I sincerely appreciate that effort. And honestly, those queue issues were worth tolerating, because Endwalker was such a masterpiece in almost every conceivable way. From the heavy and well-deserved emotional payoff, to the gorgeous art design of locations, to the incredible voice acting of pretty much the entire cast, to the ear-catching original score that is loaded with impressive use of leitmotifs, to the fun duties with great and creative mechanics. There's room to argue that Shadowbringers is a better contained story, and I understand that comment. Perhaps I even agree with it to an extent, but Endwalker is the finale that this first saga deserved. Yoshi P, Ishikawa, Soken, and all the other talented people behind this expansion crafted not just one of the best story-driven MMO experiences, but one of the best pieces of RPG content, period. Final Fantasy XIV is a game that has a ton of hype surrounding it, and it's one of the few games to genuinely deserve every last bit of it. It will assuredly go down as a landmark in the history of both MMOs and RPGs in general, and for many good reasons. And that's it. That's my top 5. The games I loved the most in 2021. I know there's a lot of other good games that I didn't really have time to play, but like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm just one guy with a full-time job, so I have only so many hours to reasonably spend on games. A few noteworthy ones simply won't be able to get squeezed in. That's unfortunately just how it goes. This is just one person's list anyway. Either way, I still really loved all the aforementioned games, and I'm glad I played them. This also marks the second year in a row where a Final Fantasy game takes the #1 spot. I swear I am not sponsored or anything. It's looking unlikely that Final Fantasy XVI will release this year, so I don't think a third year in a row is going to happen. And even if it does come out this year, it would still have Elden Ring to compete against. Overall, 2021, despite the constant delays caused by the pandemic, was still able to be a pretty solid year, and I'm eager for what the rest of 2022 has to offer. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.